Classification. It's a subject in biology and many other sciences that most students cringe when they hear the name because we often think of it as quite a boring subject. However, classification is something you have been doing since you were born. It's something that allows our brain to actually organize and understand the world around us. So although you might sound boring, it is actually something you do inherently and instinctively every day of your life without even thinking about it. And in science, we use it to help not only understand the world around us, but to communicate to each other, to use our understandings to delve deeper into organisms, and also to transfer understandings from one situation to another. So let's go into it a little bit further. So classification, as I just said before, is how we organize things around us. It's how we make sense of the world around us, and we do it by looking for similarities and differences. That's pretty much the crux of organization. However, when you look at it from a biological perspective, it gets a little bit more difficult because in the first example we're going to do one classification system, and there are many different systems here. We classify things depending on a purpose. So the first system we're going to look at is the taxonomic classification system, which is how we name organisms, and it has a purpose, naming. So with that system, we have to try and get down to grouping everything or organisms together until every organism in one particular group at the lowest level is a species. Okay, they all of the same type, they can breed with each other. That is what a species is. But there are billions, or have been billions of species on Earth. So trying to organize them into individual species groups is actually really hard. And if we tried to do it all on one level, you'd have on that one level billions of different groups. And that wouldn't really help us to make much sense of them at all. So what we do is we actually organize them into groups of similarity and difference, but at different levels to try and help make sense of them all. So the easiest way to understand it is how we group animals together, like ones that have backbones and ones that don't. Those groups help us make sense of those animals and how they're organized better than if we tried to put them all on just one level. Now, when we talk about using levels as well as just grouping things, we call that a hierarchy, and you have to remember that word. Now, like I said, classification in biology, there's many different systems, and the system depends on the purpose. So you are going to have to learn about just a few different systems. There are many more than this. Taxonomic is how we name things. Reproductive classification systems are pretty darn important. Now remember, the type of system is related to the purpose. So if we've got organisms who are on the brink of extinction and we need to help them, breed them so that they can actually come back in their numbers, their species name and how they're classified with a name is not going to help me understand much about how they reproduce. So we actually have systems for organizing and classifying the different ways that organisms reproduce, and then we use that information to try and help us figure out what to do with that species. So if you know how to help one type of species with similar reproductive methods to another organism reproduce, if you know how one group of them reproduces, you can usually then transfer that knowledge to another organism with similar reproductive strategies to try and help them come back from the brink. So the system that we use is dependent on the purpose. Now, one of the big ones that you're going to be learning about is not about animals, but about ecosystems as a whole. So large areas where living and non-living things interact. So there's different classification systems that we'll go into in more detail later on from ecosystem perspective. Holdridge Life Zones, you need to know. SPECS classification system. Australian National Aquatic Ecosystem Classification System. Yes, I know it's a big mouthful. We call it ANAE for short. And a little one that honestly I couldn't even find a picture of, but they do say it's going to be on final test. EUNIS, which is the European Nature Information System. Not many pictures on that one, but basically it's a series of questions that help to break organisms up to classify them. We'll be focusing mainly on the first three. Okay, why the heck do we classify anything? I've already made a few points. Firstly, it helps us to understand and comprehend the world around us by organising things in a manner that our brain can then start to go, oh yeah, I know you, I don't know you. Okay, and it allows us to comprehend the world around us. Babies do it instinctively. I mean, who do I cry with and who am I happy with? Do I know them? Don't I know them? They classify even from birth. Okay, a baby can tell if an organism is their mother or not. So this is something we do instinctively. Now, in science, it helps us from many different perspectives. Not only about similarities and differences, but it allows us to communicate effectively with each other. There's a classic example I remember from years ago. Scientists were trying to communicate between Australia and England about plants who are under water stress. So they classified or had diagnosed that each of these plants had, or series of plants had water stress, and they were trying to share data so that they could actually communicate with each other and use each other's learnings about water stress to help the other. However, none of the data matched and they couldn't figure it out. And it's because the way they classified water stress was actually different. Okay, and this is where it comes down to we also need rules for how we classify things and definitions for how we classify things. Water stress in England is very different from water stress in Australia. Water stress in England means the plants are essentially drowning, and water stress in Australia means that the plants are dehydrated. So, of course, the data didn't match. So there's two learnings from that little story. Number one, when I tell you to follow the rules for how to classify something, look at the rules and the definitions because they're very important to follow. Otherwise, we're talking different languages. And once you do follow those rules, and things are classified effectively. So in the case of water stress, there would be a classification system for different types of, not just diseases, but different types of problems that plants have. There's a classification system for naming those things. You have to make sure that you follow those naming protocols so that when we communicate, we're talking about the same thing. Another thing it helps is improvement of identification of species. So when you actually have the taxonomic classification naming system, okay, that's what taxonomy is, how you name it and how you identify it. If we already have a predetermined set of definitions for what different organisms are and how they fit into categories, then when a new one comes along, it's pretty easy then to try and figure out how to name it, because we just have to find out what category it fits into. A few other reasons about why we classify. We can then use those classifications to try and look at how similar or different organisms are. Many organisms share a lot of characteristics, but they're also very different in many ways. So fish and cats, they're both vertebrates. They both have a backbone. However, they are extremely different in many other ways. So we actually classify them into different groups for that very reason. We can then use or make assumptions about the traits that an organism has. So when it comes down to fish, the way it's classified allows me to make assumptions about, well, if it's a fish, then I know, number one, it's got eukaryotic cells, so cells with membrane-bound organelles. I know it definitely will, because it falls into the vertebrate family, that it definitely has a backbone. I know that it also has a cranium, it has a spinal cord, all of those different things that, because it's an animal that moves independently, so all of those different traits, I can make assumptions of those traits based on how we classify it, because every organism that is in that category shares a whole heap of different traits, because it's the traits that we've used in order to give it the classification that it has. The most important thing, though, is assumptions and transfer of knowledge. So when it comes to ecosystems, if you do a study on how to help, say, an aquatic creek ecosystem, on how to, say, remove specific chemicals from that system in order to try and help the animals in that habitat, you can then transfer that learning to other creek systems. assuming that they have similar characteristics. So once you've classified something as a particular type of system, in this case a creek, learning on one sort of creek system is transferable as long as you classify them correctly. However, you wouldn't necessarily use the same techniques to try and help animals in a marine ecosystem, because it's salt water. Even though it's water-based, it's just salt water, and it's not going to be as easily transferable. And in many cases, the techniques are not going to work, because if we're using different extraction methods to try and, say, extract pollution, it's going to work different in a freshwater environment compared to a saltwater environment. So we can make assumptions about how we can transfer knowledge to similar systems, and what systems are going to be too different for us to transfer that knowledge easily. Okay, that's a really important point. I'll reiterate it again, but it's only just one slide. When we do have a classification, follow the rules. Very, very important, because as you might have noticed when it came to the water-stressed plants, you actually have to follow the definitions properly in order to categorize things properly. Otherwise, we're talking two different languages.